Hello, my name is Kiran Joni. This is the second part of the 8th session of the introduction series of the Eso-Loop Framework. In the previous session, I introduced effectual self-organization as a primary constraint. While this was an important addition as an effort against autonomy hijacking, and also as a reminder that you are already a complex self-organizing system, or the entrepreneur themselves are already a complex self-organizing system. Even though this is the case, it must be understood that self-organization alone is not enough for our purpose. We can do much more than that. Self-organization is a ubiquitous feature and an important and irreplaceable foundation. But self-organization is not free from various contextual constraints and conditions. The outcome will be mostly determined by the constraints by which, through which, and around which self-organization takes place. Like in the case of the parable of the sower of the seed, only the seeds that fell into the good soil will self-organize to produce great corn. Most of the seeds may self-organize if provided with basic conditions. But the thriving of the seed to corn or a tree depends on many different types of constraints and conditions. This is obvious when we consider, for example, business geography or socio-economic status of entrepreneurs. For example, the conditions and constraints in a war-torn African nation for doing entrepreneurship is different from a place like San Francisco or Miami or Bangalore. Similarly, the conditions and constraints available for a person from a weaker socioeconomic status is different from a person coming from a rich background, outliers excluded. It must also be remembered that apart from this kind of social level macro constraints, we also have individual unique types of constraints as discussed in the first part of this session. Now, because of all these issues, in this part, our goal is thus to use the frame of context-sensitive and context-free constraints to introduce various enabling constraints to increase the dispositional propensity of positive things happening for the entrepreneur and decrease the dispositional propensity of negative things happening for the entrepreneur. This points to a very significant aspect of a complex system like entrepreneurship. That is, we cannot target specific dynamics when we are designing a solution at the point of design. Because this is a dynamical system, we cannot predict everything that is going to happen. So the design possibility is limited in this regard. Now, these default functional enabling constraints that are categorized as context sensitive and context free could be seen in three different ways. Primarily, it can be seen as a temporary scaffold that supports entrepreneurial agency. Secondly, it can be seen as similar to an Iron Man suit. The suit comes with pre-designed capabilities. And if one uses the suit's default capabilities will become the agent's capabilities or the user's capabilities. Clearly, these two types of constraints can be seen as like an Android phone or iPhone, in which new apps can be made, added, edited, updated, changed, and removed, signifying an important aspect, that is evolvability and adaptability of the framework itself. This idea will be further discussed in the upcoming parts. Now, before I introduce the specific two types of constraints, it is important to remember that whatever comes before the context or a priori the context, that is in this framework considered context-free. So this means even the entire Eso-Loop framework is a context-free constraint. It is an irony, but that is the way in which we are viewing the framework. It is also important to understand that my use of Alicia Herrera's framework of context-sensitive and context-free constraint is not to represent her articulation accurately, but to make use of her idea to design a solution for entrepreneurs. This means particularly the idea of context-sensitive constraint here in this framework is not used to represent her idea accurately, but as an enabling constraint that scaffolds entrepreneurial exploration towards key attractive dimensions. Even though this is the case, the ultimate intention here for this design is to bring the entrepreneur towards the original meaning that was intended by Alicia Herrero. So let me start this introduction with the context-free constraints. It is important here to understand that the core context-free constraints or default functional dispositions of this framework was developed based on the ideas that we discussed in the third session. These ideas are selected and introduced based on framework relevance and also based on confirmation from many applied complexity models. For example, the guided self-organization approach, which was co-developed by Carlos Christensen, points to key concepts like adaptation, robustness, anti-fragility, mediators, slower is faster effect, and heterogeneity. Most of these ideas are adapted to this framework as context-free constraints, which will be discussed in a while. So in the initial provisional design of the core context-free constraints or default functional dispositions, I listed 6 core ideas. They are agency, diversity, affordances, adaptiveness, evolvability, and permanent work in progress. The first key default dispositional propensity of the framework is agency. Here it is suggested that agency should be free from rigid external control and must be contextually sensitive via developing relationality. This disposition is about enabling the cultivation of an appropriate type of agency and also to prevent agency hijack by people, processes, models, tools, etc. It is about avoiding extremes of isolated self-control at one end and agency hijack on the other end. We have to cultivate a particular kind of agency, that is relational agency. So that is the dispositional propensity or context-free constraint introduced as the first context-free constraint. This suggests that no matter what you do, you're always concerned about your agency. And agency is very much connected to the idea of autonomy. So also, as we already discussed in the 7th session, for self-organization to take place, autonomy is an important aspect. Without autonomy, self-organization cannot happen. The decision what to do next should come from inside the system. That is a point we need to remember when we think about agency. Agency hijack is the way in which other people, their ideas, tools, methods, prescriptive solutions will attempt to take away your autonomy, ultimately leading to damaging the self-organization potential. The second key context-free constraint is diversity. This disposition is about enabling cultivation of diversity, more specifically, a diversity that is specific to entrepreneurial ecology, in which the entrepreneur is embedded. It is also about balancing the extremes and constantly being sensitive to the context. That is avoiding lack of diversity at one end and also avoiding too much diversity that might affect coherence and survival of the system. So diversity must be regulated. It is also about cultivating continuous effort to capture the true diverse features of the entrepreneurial world in which the entrepreneur is embedded. For example, the entrepreneur must be encouraged to explore the state space for functional affordances in dimensions like diversity in people, their skill sets, networks, information sources, relational expertise, institutions, specializations, artifacts, tools, etc. So both idea level exploration and real world level exploration must go hand in hand to cultivate the type of diversity that is functional for the entrepreneurial success. The third key context-free constraint is affordance. Affordances refers to offerings or action possibilities in the environment in relation to the action capabilities of the actor. So it is about a direct relationship between an actor and the action possibilities available in the environment that is specific to that particular actor. The dispositional propensity of affordances can be used to check the ecological validity of prescriptive models, prescriptive solutions, education programs, ideas that is used in the domain of entrepreneurship, etc. This will help us promote ecological validity of ideas, models, etc. And it will also help us to prevent ecologically invalid ideas from taking too much time, space, and resource. Affordances as a dispositional propensity will act as a tendency of the framework and also the framework users to connect the criteria concepts, their own specific criteria concepts, to affordances available to the actor or the learner. This will ecologically ground the propensity of the entire system to contextual reality instead of promoting decontextualized or decontextualizable cognitive symbolic ideas like mindset or personality or any other kinds of ideas that are imported from cognitive science. It is also important to remember that I'm not proposing this against ideas like mindset, but it is proposed to enable the ecological grounding. Even if we use the idea of mindset, that should be grounded in reality some way. It shouldn't be suggesting that the poor people are poor because of their mindset. If somebody suggests that kind of things, it is too contextually withdrawn from ethics and reality. This context-free constraint can also be seen as an indirect prompt to embrace more ecological criteria like affordance, external enablers, propensity, etc. The fourth key context-free constraint is adaptiveness. This part stresses the adaptiveness of the individual to environment. This context-free constraint or dispositional propensity is about enabling adaptiveness to the framework users, and the stakeholders in accordance with the novel emergent realities. It is not about prescribing ways to improve adaptiveness, but to enabling the entrepreneurs to find what it means to be adaptive in his or her own context. The next key context-free constraint is evolvability. This context-free constraint or dispositional propensity is about evolvability. Since I have discussed diversity and adaptiveness, which are two qualities necessary for the self-organizing complex adaptive system, this part is about the overarching concept of system evolution and how we can enable evolvability as a dispositional propensity. Here also, the practical agenda is not about prescribing ways to improve evolvability, but to enable the entrepreneurs to find what it means to be evolvable in his or her own context. The sixth and final default context-free constraint is the permanent work in progress. This context-free constraint acknowledges Eso-Loop Framework itself as a permanent work in progress. It provides the capability to make changes to the framework itself. This is in acknowledgement of the fact that the world is constantly changing, and we must provide ourselves adequate opportunities to change accordingly. So this means that you can introduce changes to this framework itself. So this can be seen as an extension to the idea of evolvability. The permanent work in progress suggests that the framework itself acknowledges its possible weakness, and the framework users are seen as co-creators of the framework. They are encouraged to add ideas, design, and change the framework itself to suit their own contextual demands and dispositions. That's the end of the introduction to the context-free constraint. These are the 6 core default context-free constraints. Now that I introduced 6 of the default context-free constraints, it is important to remember also that the entrepreneur always comes with their own context-free constraints. And if these context-free constraints involve models like business plan or lean startup, this might be counterproductive. But if the default constraints of the framework will get the primacy, then this is not a problem. This is why it is important to understand that if the actor uses this framework, the primacy of these default constraints will be a dispositional reality than an option. So it is like using the Iron Man suit. The suit has certain dispositional propensities, certain capabilities. Even though the suit is adaptable, changeable, default constraints or default capabilities will get primacy. Then only the system will work properly. This can be equated to the Android or iPhone system apps. Even though this app can also be changed, this change can affect the function of the entire system. So now that I completed introducing the 6 core default context-free constraints, it is important to understand that the users in this framework can use and add or design in their own context-free constraints that are compatible with the ideas that we already discussed. For example, I added 2 more context-free constraints in the praxis session. They are enskillment and sense-making. These ideas will be discussed in the next session. This means the users can also add their own choices that conforms with the default constraints. So this is the end of the introduction to the context-free constraints part of the 8th session. To recap, the default context-free constraints are really the default dispositional propensities of the framework and the framework uses. This suggests that if you are using this framework, these default context-free constraints will become your dispositional propensities, the user's dispositional propensities. This means you cannot ignore agency, you cannot ignore diversity, you cannot ignore affordances and ecological validity, you cannot ignore adaptiveness, you cannot ignore evolvability, and finally, you cannot ignore the importance of a permanent work in progress. All of these are primary constraints. So that's a key idea of the context-sensitive constraints. In the next video, that is a third part of the 8th session of this introduction series of the Eso-Loop framework, I will discuss the second key type of constraints, that is context-sensitive constraints. So see you soon in the next part of this session.